Welcome to the Last March of Quirinus, a Roman epic forged in blood, betrayal, and unyielding honour. When the empire turns its back on its own, one general dares to march into legend. Written by Brian M. Brumbaugh, narrated by Ned Ratter. Please subscribe now and march with him. Now we begin. Chapter 1. The forest drinks blood. The gods had abandoned them long before the horns. Fog choked the trees near the Weser, thick, oily, the kind that clung to skin like mourning shrouds. The men of the 18th Legion called it the White Death, half in jest the night before. Now, by first light, it lived up to its name. They marched in perfect formation, disciplined, armoured, unaware. Bronze standards held high, leather greaves shining with dew. Quirinus Octavius rode beside the legate, one hand resting on the hilt of his gladius, the other clutching a wool cloak to keep the frost off his neck. He hated Germania, hated the way the silence here was never truly silent, always some whisper behind the trees, a branch snapping, a breath held too long. It began with birds, or rather, the absence of them. Then the scream of the first pilum, arching down like a vulture's talon, striking the legate through the mouth mid-order. He toppled from his horse, eyes frozen in half-command. Quirinus was still blinking blood from his face when the forest came alive. Hundreds of Germanic warriors erupted from the mists like ghosts, bare-chested, painted, howling in every tongue of the damned. They moved with the trees, not against them, emerging from roots and trunks and the spaces between thought. Every Roman line wavered under the weight of it. Shields clanged, orders vanished under screaming. Quirinus drew steel. The first to meet him was a youth, maybe 16, blond and mud-slick, swinging a crude axe with more fury than technique. Quirinus sidestepped, took the boy through the gut, and kept walking. No hesitation, no prayer. He screamed for the standard to be held high, for the cohort to form into testudo. But the 18th was fracturing. One wing routed into the woods. Another bled out, trying to regroup around the mangled body of the legate. He found himself face to face with centurions, already dying, already backing away. "To me!" Quirinus roared, slamming his shield against a dying tree, splintering bark. "Fall back and form! Sound the cornu!" A horn blasted from somewhere, twisted, broken, too late. A Germanic giant, hair matted in wolf pelts, leapt from a ridge and crushed a Roman rider beneath a stone hammer. Quirinus surged up the hill to meet him, sidestepped the swing, and drove his blade through the man's armpit, twisting until bone cracked like bark in winter. It was no longer a battle, it was slaughter. By midday, half the 18th Legion was dead or dying. Corpses hung on branches, eyes pecked out by early carrion birds. Blood painted the snow in wide sweeps where shields had turned to sleds, dragging the wounded downhill. Quirinus, coated in gore, stood knee-deep in mud beside a burned-out cart, rallying the living. A makeshift perimeter of dead horses and overturned wagons gave them cover for now. His voice was raw, his arms numb. He had lost track of how many times he'd killed. A junior tribune approached, bloodied, eyes wide, barely old enough to shave. Sir, we have no scouts left. None returned from the east. The forest is crawling. They're not chasing us. They're herding." Quirinus stared at him, the words crawling in slow. Herding. He looked around at the remains of the 18th, perhaps 3,000 still standing, maybe less, many without helmets, some without shoes. They had food for 2 days, water for 1. He turned his eyes westward, toward Rome. A grizzled Optio limped toward him, arm in a sling. "We found the river, General. It's not where the map said. We're too far. Way too far." Quirinus didn't flinch. "How far?" The man's voice broke. 200 miles, maybe more." A pause. "And we're surrounded." The silence that followed was sacred. Not even the birds dared interrupt. Quirinus stood still for a long moment, watching snow fall onto the open eye of a decapitated legionary. Then he turned back toward the men, raised the crimson cloak of the legate from the corpse, and slung it over his own shoulders. "The forest drinks blood," he said quietly, "and I will make it choke." Chapter 2. The price of survival. There was no sun in Germania, only smoke. After the ambush, after the carnage and screams, after the gods had proven themselves deaf or dead, the battered remnants of the 18th Legion were little more than animals clinging to discipline like a shredded cloak. And Quirinus Octavius, last unbroken officer, became the ghost they followed. The clearing they'd claimed was no safer than the forest, but it gave them time to stack the bodies, bury the wounded, and pretend, just for a moment, that they still held shape. The first order he gave wasn't for retreat or defence, it was for silence. No crying out, no prayers aloud, no songs, not even the death rites, he growled. "We are not to wake the forest again." The fires they lit were small and scattered, cook fires no larger than a man's fist. Enough to warm fingers, not meals. He rationed everything: beans, grain, horse meat sliced from the haunches of their dead mounts. They boiled leather sandals for broth. They scraped ice from leaves and strained it through cloth already soaked with blood. A centurion's son was caught stealing salt. Quirinus had him flogged and then made him lead the burial detail. By nightfall, the boy's arms were shaking as he shovelled the last mound of frozen soil over a pit filled with a dozen nameless comrades. Quirinus ordered the survivors to break camp, not run, not scatter, but build as they moved. He called it Castra Motus, the walking fortress. The men of the 18th, now less than 3,000 strong, formed into rotating blocks. Shields on the outside, spears inward, archers in the centre. The wounded and the carts, lashed together with vine and hide, moved in the protected heart. Their march became ritual: wake before dawn, check gear, clean blades with snow, eat whatever the day allowed, bury the dead, walk until frostbite demanded halt, then repeat. Morale didn't rise, it calcified. The men stopped asking how far, they stopped talking of home. They simply moved. The forest devoured scouts like a hungry god. Quirinus sent them in teams of 2, never alone. North, east, south, back west again. Some returned with arrows in their sides, eyes wild, whispering about things moving in the branches. One came back missing a tongue, the stump crudely burned closed. Another returned speaking only in whispers, saying, "We're not marching through forest, we're marching through bone." That one was found dead the next day, hanging from a branch with his own belt. Only 5 out of the original 11 made it back. And Quirinus? He marked it down in charcoal on a stripped bark scroll, along with every name, rank, and the direction they'd gone. Even when the ink ran out, he kept writing. The chatty were near. The scouts that returned whispered of movement, not attacks, but shadowing. Every time the legion stopped, the brush moved. Every time they buried a fallen soldier, a vulture arrived too quickly. And then, finally, a message came. Not on parchment. It came in the form of a merchant, tied to a pole, dragged behind a stolen Roman horse, his body pierced with splinters to hold open his mouth. Inside, a rolled scrap of hide, a name written in smudged red ochre, Agaron, a warband leader, a chatty tactician with a taste for Roman blood and Roman coin. His offer was simple: give me 50 men, unarmed. I will give you a road west. The council erupted when Quirinus read it aloud. We'd be feeding him, brothers. One officer shouted. He's bluffing. Another spat. He'll take the men and still bleed us out. Rome doesn't sell its own. Rome's not here, Quirinus said flatly. And we are not gods. The fire cracked. He stared into it long enough to make silence painful. We are surrounded. Our wounded will not survive the next march. We are out of salt, out of salves. If we do nothing, we die. If we make this bargain, some of us live. He turned to the fire again. I will not sacrifice children. I will not give up officers. I will not hand over volunteers. These 50 will be chosen. He made the Optios pick. Each was given 1 hour to submit a name list of their 10 most wounded, least mobile or lowest value. It broke men. Officers wept into their helmets. One stabbed himself in the thigh with a quill and claimed madness to avoid the choice. Another tried to flee. Quirinus had him bound to a tree and read aloud the names he had not chosen, shaming the man not for cowardice, but cruelty. Then left him there overnight. He complied the next morning. When the chosen were pulled from the camp, some on stretchers, some begging, some silent, Quirinus refused to meet their eyes. Except one, a veteran named Titus Calvus, who had taken an arrow to the groin and could no longer walk. Titus only asked one question: will my daughter still get my pension? Quirinus placed a denarius in his hand and whispered, no one will know how you died, then turned away. They met Agaron in a cold ravine, where water trickled black and birds did not nest. The Chatti emerged from the mist like creatures out of funeral stories, faces smeared with lye and bone dust, teeth filed, their weapons iron-hacked into brutal shapes. They said nothing, only stood, waiting. The prisoners were lined up. 50. Quirinus gave the signal. He didn't speak to Agaron, didn't ask what would happen to the men, didn't explain why they were here. He only said one thing: I will not make this trade twice. Agaron smiled. You will. Then he disappeared into the trees, leaving only footprints and the sound of screaming long after the fog closed behind them. That night no one sat near Quirinus. No one asked for orders. He stared into the flames again, but this time even they recoiled. The fire did not dance. It only burned, slow and quiet. He slept with his hand on his sword and dreamed of a tree made from spears, each branch heavy with Roman helmets, and beneath it a girl with his eyes asking why. Chapter 3. The Pact with the Wolves. Before the gods cursed him with command, Quirinus Octavius had a different name, one born of gutter filth, not glory. He remembered the gutters of the Subura as a place of teeth and mud, of piss puddles steaming in the morning, of fistfights for a heel of bread. He remembered the men who kicked him, the women who ignored him, the dog that shared his warmth and died in his arms. He was 10 the first time he killed someone. A slave boy tried to gut him over a stolen fig. Quirinus used a broken amphora neck and didn't stop cutting. That was the day he got noticed. Senator Gaius Decimus Octavius found him in a gutter surrounded by blood, rats, and whimpers. The old man had no legitimate sons. He admired strength, even in the dirt. Quirinus became Octavius that day. He was given a name, a home, and a brutal education in the games of Rome. Swords, Senate lies, and the art of loyalty through silence. And yet, even in silk, Quirinus never stopped hearing the wolves in the alleys. The forest thickened with shadow and silence as the 18th moved again. After the slave trade, no one spoke unless ordered to. The men marched with hollow eyes, devouring cold and doubt like grain. It was on the 6th night of the retreat that she came, the seer. No one saw her arrive. One moment, the woods were empty. The next, she stood by the fire, barefoot, cloaked in wolf pelts, her face streaked with ash and ochre, hair like midnight fog, eyes like thawed ice. She said nothing at first, just stared at Quirinus from beyond the flames. The sentries froze. Quirinus didn't blink. Finally she spoke. "You are being hunted by something older than men, and you've already lost the first game. What are you?" he asked. "I am the cost." He stood. "What do you want?" "A pact." She moved closer, and he saw her fingers were stained with blood. Her own, maybe, maybe not. Her voice was jagged glass, but steady. "For every path I reveal, one of your men dies. That's happening anyway," Quirinus said. "Not like this, I choose." "Not you? How many paths?" "As many as you can stomach." She reached into her cloak and handed him a bundle of bound sticks, each carved with symbols and stained with soot. "Break one, place it in fire. I will show the next direction. But understand this, Roman, for every road I light I take a name. You will not choose who. The forest does." She was gone the next morning. The sticks remained. Quirinus did not speak of the seer to the whole legion, only to the 3 men who mattered most. Uran the Gaul, a mountain of a man with a face like an avalanche, survived 5 campaigns and 2 marriages, fought for Rome but worshipped his ancestors, loyal only to Quirinus. Dren, a mute Dacian scout who communicated in taps and glances, claimed he once crossed the Carpathians in winter on foot with no food. His eyes were sharper than any blade. A brother Malleus, a priest of Mars, pale and shaking, whose voice cracked during blessings and who no longer carried a sword. Once a zealot, now a whisper of faith. Quirinus summoned them to a hollow near a dead oak and told them of the pact. Varan spat. "She's a wolf bitch playing at riddles." Dren only nodded once. Malleus wept. "The gods are watching. You're making pacts with ghosts." Quirinus looked at each of them. "We make this pact," he said, "because the gods you serve have already watched us die." He broke the first stick. The next day they turned north, not east as they'd planned. They found a stream, unfrozen and clean. Further up, they found a Germanic burial site with dried meat offerings enough for a week. 3 of the missing scouts staggered out of the woods alive, but that night a boy drowned in his sleep. No one knew why. Quirinus did. He burned the second stick the day after. The road curved gently into a forgotten Roman outpost. Abandoned, supplies still sealed, a miracle, warmth. A cook slipped on ice and cracked his skull. Then a senior tribune collapsed of fever and bled from the eyes. The men began to whisper. They watched Quirinus whenever the fire crackled. On the 9th day, one cohort snapped. Led by Decanus Milo, a firebrand who claimed Quirinus had made a deal with the devil's womb. He riled the men into breaking ranks, hoarding food, and trying to flee south. They took 60 men with them. Quirinus gave no speech. He gave no trial. He ordered Dren and Varan to seal them inside a ravine, using oil, mud, and the last barrels of Greek fire they'd salvaged from a broken siege cart. At dusk he stood at the mouth of the gulch and said one thing: "This is the cost of disobedience and mercy." Then he lit the torch and dropped it. The screams lasted 7 minutes. The next morning the men of the 18th moved again. No one spoke to Quirinus, no one dared, Not even Varan. The seer had not returned, but the sticks still remained. Now only 7 left. Quirinus kept them wrapped in leather, tied at his belt beside his gladius. Every path forward was a blood-washed gamble. Every miracle bought with flesh. As the forest thinned and snow began to harden into ice, Quirinus walked at the head of the column, eyes forward, jaw clenched. He had not wept. He had not broken. But somewhere in the woods behind him, a wolf was howling, and it was learning his name. Chapter 4. The crossing of iron and ice. The snow had turned yellow in places. Piss, blood, rot. It no longer mattered. The men of the 18th trudged through it like ghosts, armour crusted with ice, teeth clenched to keep them from chattering. Hunger gnawed with teeth sharper than spears. They boiled tree bark. They gnawed leather scraps. One man was caught eating moss off a dead man's boot. Quirinus didn't punish him. He simply handed him a strip of salted horsehide from the last beast they'd butchered and told him to chew slow. The cold wasn't a presence anymore. It was a religion, and death its high priest. The wolves were never seen, only heard. Whispers, footsteps, soft crunching in the snow when no one moved. Varan the Gaul insisted they were following the same path every night, staying just out of arrow range, never attacking. "They're herding us," he growled. Quirinus agreed, but not out loud. One morning they found a soldier's head placed on a spear beside the trail. The eyes were missing. The mouth was stuffed with pine needles. That night no one slept. The fire pits burned brighter. Dren the Dacian kept watch without blinking. Quirinus lay awake, staring into the fire, listening to the wind snarl through the branches like a god laughing. They reached it just past dusk, a black wound cutting through the earth, wide, furious. The edges were frozen solid, but the centre boiled and crashed with icy rage. Some of the men dropped to their knees on the riverbank, not to pray, but because their bodies finally gave up the pretense of strength. The water roared louder than any battle. There was no bridge, no ford, no hope, just the cold judgment of the gods. Brother Malleus fell to his knees and whispered, "This is where the drowned dead go." Quirinus spit into the water. "No," he said, "this is where we prove they should have stayed dead." He stood before the survivors. No speeches, no warmth. "We cross in 3 days," he said. There was silence, then laughter, bitter, disbelieving. Varan, standing to his left, silenced it with a back-handed slap across a centurion's mouth. "We build rafts, barges, rope, shield boats, anything that floats. The carts become hulls, the wheels become paddles. We don't eat tonight, we work." He looked at their skeletal faces, eyes sunken from frost and starvation. "If you think the river's too cold, think of Rome. Think of your wife, your child. Think of the wolves behind us. And know this, if you stay, you die alone. If you cross, you might live." The men got to work. They didn't believe him, but they believed in fear. The next 2 days were agony. Men stripped down to shirts, hacking branches with frost-numbed hands, teeth chattering as they lashed together makeshift frames. Wood was scavenged from old siege carts, arrow crates, even the frames of fallen comrades' stretchers. Quirinus turned everything into raw material, everything. The tent poles became oars, the centurion standards became masts. Their last bottles of pitch were boiled and smeared across the shield hulls to keep them watertight. Each time something broke, he made them start again. When a man asked why they didn't rest, Quirinus didn't shout. He simply said, "Because I'm not ready to die." It was midnight when the chatty struck. Not a full assault, just knives and speed. Painted bodies sliding through the dark like serpents, slashing tents, cutting throats. One raft was set aflame. A supply cart was rolled into the river, lost to the current. Quirinus was first to respond. He tackled one attacker mid-sprint, snapped his neck with a twist, and used the corpse as a human shield while barking orders. "Form a line! Form a fucking line!" The men rallied, arrows flew, fire lit the riverbank in flickering orange hell. Dren emerged from the trees with blood down his arms and a severed head swinging from his belt. By dawn the chatty were gone. They left behind only whispers and smoke. At noon the horns sounded from the northern ridge, Roman horns. The men broke into cheers, weak, exhausted, but genuine. They thought Rome had come for them. Instead, Rome sent a snake. Lucius Marius Priscus, golden armour, clean red cloak, war horse polished and shod with silver. Behind him marched nearly 2,000 fresh troops, untouched by the frost, untouched by blood. He dismounted with the grace of theatre. "Quirinus, you've made it further than anyone thought possible. And yet Rome sent you," Quirinus muttered. Lucius smiled, arms open like a hero. "We're here to extract the survivors, take over operations, get your men home under my banner." Quirinus said nothing. Lucius stepped closer, voice dropping. "You're exhausted. Your men are broken. Let me take the burden. You've done your part." Quirinus stared at the man's spotless boots. "You've never seen a man freeze to death. You've never watched a boy chew his own fingers off from hunger." "You don't lead this legion," Lucius scoffed. "I outrank you." Quirinus drew steel. The soldiers circled, Quirinus's ghosts and Lucius's golden toys. No one intervened. They all understood. This was Rome now. Steel, not votes. The duel began on frozen ground. The wind stilled. No words. Lucius fought like a noble. Flourish, grace, confidence. Quirinus fought like a butcher. He took hits, didn't flinch, closed in, broke Lucius's nose with a pommel smash, stabbed him in the thigh, then dragged him to the ground. "You bleed like the rest of us." Lucius gasped. "Rome! Rome won't allow." Quirinus shoved his blade through the man's heart, then stood. "Rome doesn't get a vote." They launched the first raft at twilight. It held 5 men. 3 made it across. The second raft flipped. The third drifted too far downriver, but they kept going. By midnight, a dozen makeshift vessels were in rotation. Men who could swim clung to planks. Others paddled with shields. Quirinus oversaw the launch of each one, pulling ropes with raw, cracked hands, barking orders with a voice that no longer needed volume. When the last raft reached the other side, he tied a rope around his own waist, handed the other end to Varan, and walked into the river chest deep. He crossed alone, and stood on the far bank, cloaked in mist. A general, not a man, a myth, not a leader. They buried the dead under the black pine trees just beyond the river's edge. No rites, no priests, just hands in the cold earth. Quirinus knelt beside each one, pressed a single coin into their mouth, and whispered, "You paid more than you owed." The men watched him in silence. When he was done, he stood, turned toward the west, and said, "We walk. Rome isn't going to save us, but we can still make her remember who we are." And so the 18th marched again. Behind them, the river boiled. Ahead of them, only blood and legend. Chapter 5. The dead men march. The first body rose at dusk. It was seen by a rear sentry, a boy from Hispania named Falco. He screamed once. By the time Varan and Dren reached him, his blade was buried to the hilt in what looked like a Roman soldier. Not an enemy, a Roman. The corpse wore standard issue sandals, a torn lorica, even a 6th cohort belt buckle. Its throat was open, its chest pierced, its face gone pale and puffy from the cold, but the body had moved. Lurched, the boy swore. He even claimed it reached for him. Quirinus examined the corpse. No breath, no pulse, no magic, he said. Just rot and panic. But something was off. The hands were curled, claw-like, the mouth stuffed with black moss, teeth pulled, eyes replaced with white stones. Not burial. Display. 2 days later, the patrol found more. A dozen Roman soldiers crucified upside down along the path, their armour still intact, their faces mutilated, their bodies moving ever so slightly in the wind. They looked alive in the fog. One man fell to his knees sobbing, calling out the name of his brother. Another tried to climb the cross and free the corpse. Quirinus ordered them burned. It took hours. The stench was unbearable. Varran came to him that night, stone-faced. This is not madness. This is message. They want us to think the dead walk. They want us to stop marching. Brother Malleus, now fully broken in faith, whispered, "What if they do?" Quirinus answered, "Then let them follow. They're already behind us." The illusion worked. Not the enemy's, Quirinus's. For 3 more days the legion marched in tighter formation. No songs, no fire, no sleep. Only the sound of breathing and boots in snow. Then men began to die again. Not from wounds, not from cold, from nothing. One collapsed mid-step, eyes open, heart still. Another slit his wrists while standing, without a word. A centurion tried to bury himself alive. They dug him out. He begged them to leave him. Quirinus held the line with an iron will, but even he began to feel it. The dread, the weight of something unseen pressing against the spine. The seer hadn't returned. The sticks were now 6, and morale was gone. It happened during a snowfall so thick it felt like drowning. The men stood in a clearing, not moving, not speaking, lost. Quirinus walked to the centre, still in his armour, soaked in ice, bleeding from his knuckles from punching frozen bark to stay awake. He drew his gladius and said, "I've seen the dead." The men stirred. He continued, "I've seen the ones who scream without mouths, the ones who claw without fingers. I've seen our brothers turned into masks, into warnings, into toys. You think we are cursed. You think we are followed. You're right. But they are behind us, not ahead. We are not being hunted. We are being remembered. The dead walk because we carry them. On our backs, in our hearts, in our nightmares. And I will carry them to Rome if I must." He raised his sword. "Death walks with us, but it does not walk first." But the fear remained. Men mumbled of desertion. Some carved messages into trees as if leaving wills. So Quirinus made a choice. He gathered the officers before dawn and ordered his own arrest. Varran refused. He made him do it anyway. They bound him, dragged him before the camp. Dren, grim-faced, held the sword. Quirinus knelt and said nothing. The soldiers stood in frozen silence, breath steaming, watching their general kneel in the snow, condemned by his own hand for consorting with death. Dren raised the blade and brought it down. Blood sprayed. The body collapsed. Gasps, screams, confusion. They burned it that night, or so it appeared. The next morning, just before dawn, Quirinus returned. Alive, breathing, cloaked in ash and smoke, eyes burning with something not human. He stepped into the light of the fire without a word. The soldiers backed away. He looked different, worn, taller, darker somehow. Brother Malleus fell to his knees and whispered. He crossed the veil. Quirinus only said, I saw the other side, and it's empty." From that day none spoke of mutiny again. The dead were buried with salt in their mouths and coins in their fists. The march resumed, tighter, slower, but unified. Quirinus walked at the front again, now more than a general, less than a man. Some called him cursed, others called him chosen, but all followed, and behind them, far in the distance, the wind howled, and the wolves howled back. Chapter 6. The Betrayer's Wine. They found the fort just past dusk on the 30th day of marching. Snow whipped sideways through the trees like white knives. The wind howled like it remembered names. And then stone, crumbling ramparts, a broken watchtower, half a gate swinging in the wind. Fort Arta. Quirinus had passed its name on old campaign maps during the Domitian campaigns. Abandoned for years, supposedly cursed, but they had nowhere else to go. The gates opened to a courtyard of knee-high snow and silence. The walls still stood, cracked but proud, and there were signs, faded paintings, ash-caked hearths, and deep in the rear granary, amphorae. 24, sealed, unbroken, stamped with SPQR. The men didn't cheer, not this time. They only stared at the jars like men who had seen water after weeks of drought, unsure if it was real. Quirinus approached them slowly, knelt, ran his fingers across the wax, examined the scratches. Too clean, too recent, too easy. "We test before we taste," he ordered. The officers gathered by torchlight. Dren and Varan stood to either side. Brother Malleus muttered silent prayers, his faith too wounded to speak them aloud. The wine was opened in front of everyone. Tribune Caelius Honoratus volunteered. He uncorked a jug, sniffed it, swirled it, poured into a tin cup, raised it. "It's clean, blessed, a gift from the gods." He raised the cup, but did not drink. Quirinus noticed, but didn't speak. Instead, he had 3 volunteers step forward, senior legionaries who had earned the right. They each drank half-cups and were told to rest, report in the morning. That night, the amphorae were divided among the men. The wine flowed in whispers, not shouts. Laughter came, but it was strained, like they were mocking the silence. The air felt lighter, but only for hours. At first it was coughing, then convulsions. By second watch, 5 men were dead, black foam at their lips, bellies swollen, some bleeding from the eyes. By dawn it was 20. They died with no honour, no combat, just pain, retching, blood from both ends. Faces contorted into grotesque masks. One man collapsed into the fire, trying to crawl for help. Brother Malleus wept over the corpses. "This isn't plague, this is vengeance." Quirinus tasted the wine again. This time he caught it, a trace of belladonna, crushed and dissolved into the liquid, masked with honey and resin, deliberate, precise, and meant to wait. He summoned every officer, checked rosters, double-checked who had first access, who transported the crates, who catalogued the find, and the evidence began to pile. Caelius Honoratus had, and discovered the amphorae. One volunteered to test them, 10 chosen who drank first, never took a sip himself. And, most damning, his tent held a pouch of chatty gold wrapped in a Roman handkerchief. When confronted, he laughed. "Do you think I poisoned our men for coin?" He sneered. "No, I did it to end this madness. We are lost, we are cursed. Quirinus is no general, he's a damned spirit dragging us into myth." Varan struck him across the face. Honoratus bled, smiled. "Strike me again and see what else I confess." A field tribunal was held at noon. But no one argued. The men did not shout. They did not demand punishment. They stood in frozen ranks as Quirinus stepped forward, his cloak dragging through red-stained snow. "Rome's laws don't reach this far," he said, "but Roman justice does." He turned to Honoratus. "You chose gold over brothers. You killed for convenience. You made yourself a wolf among sheep." Honoratus spat. "You already made them beasts." Quirinus drew his gladius, not to kill, but to cut free his armour, then die like one. He was stripped, armour removed, tunic torn away. They marched him to the centre of the ruined fort. Dren and 2 others drove a post into the earth, deep into frozen stone. Honoratus was bound to it, naked, arms behind him, ankles bleeding from the tight lash. Quirinus turned to the legion. "This is not punishment, this is protection. The cold will kill him, but it will save us." He walked away. The men stayed. Honoratus cursed them for hours, then begged, then whimpered, then fell silent. By dawn he was still, his face frozen in a rictus of terror, eyelids crusted with ice. Quirinus didn't allow his burial. He left him as he was, frozen, stiff, and visible from every corner of the camp, and the men looked, every morning, every night. He became more than an example. He became a reminder. A curse repelled. Even the wolves stopped circling that night. Something hardened in the legion after that. Not rage, not grief, just steel. The weak stopped asking for breaks. The sick began walking on shattered feet. Discipline returned, not in force, but chosen. Even Brother Malleus stopped praying. Instead, he carved the names of the dead into his shield. Quirinus said nothing, but he watched the men sleep with weapons drawn, watched them eat in silence, watched them stop looking back, and then, without ceremony, without order, they began marching again. Chapter 7. The Blood Forest. The map didn't mark it, but the trees remembered. They grew too close, twisted, black at the bark, even under snow. Bones had fed them, Roman bones. Quirinus didn't need confirmation. The scouts returned with shields half buried in loam, rusted pilum tips, pieces of lorica wrapped in roots. Teutoburg, where 3 legions died in a storm of mud and betrayal under Publius Quinctilius Varus, long before Quirinus was born, where the forest swallowed Rome whole and burped bones. Brother Malleus whispered, "This place is cursed." Quirinus said, "Then we bleed it clean." By nightfall they were being watched. Figures flitted between trees, whistles in the dark, shadows too still. Dren confirmed it, thousands. Quirinus climbed a dead ridge and looked over the frozen canopy. In the far distance, movement, smoke trails, torches flickering in organised lines. This was no tribal skirmish. This was a mustering. And then came the horns. Deep, throaty, answered by wolf howls, and then came the drums. They'd been led into a trap, and Quirinus knew it. He also knew how to break it. Under torchlight, he laid out his plan in the snow with a broken spear. 2 cohorts under Varron would march directly north, visible, slow. 2 others under Dren would vanish into the trees, flanking west. Quirinus would lead the rear force, hidden, watching. When the main Germanic army closed on Varron's bait line, the flanking force would strike with fire and horns. Then Quirinus's unit would hit the heart. They had 1 night to prepare, 1 night to say goodbye. Some men did, others just stared into the fire, sharpening blades that would never return home. Quirinus walked between them, silent, staring. He said nothing, but they followed. The snow stopped at dawn. The sky was still bleeding grey when the first wave came. 10,000 Germanic warriors, smeared in blood and ash, howling, charging with axes, spears and fire. Their leader, Harwick the Red Wolf, rode a black stallion, bare-chested, beard bound in bronze rings, screaming like a god of old. Varan's line stood firm, shields up, spears out. They held longer than expected. Then they broke by design. They pulled back. The Germans surged forward. That's when the forest erupted. From the west, horns. Dozens, Roman, twisting, wailing, unnatural. Then came the flames. Dren's men set the woods ablaze with pitch and fire pots, smoke blinding the flanks. Germanic warriors howled in confusion. That's when Quirinus struck. He burst from the south with 200 men, gladi drawn, voices raised, no formation, no banners, just violence. The centre of the Germanic force turned too late. Axes met shields, spears met flesh. The snow turned red, then black. Quirinus fought like the wolf they feared, shoulder-checking brutes into trees, stabbing low, kicking ribs, crushing skulls. He lost his helmet, lost his blade, took another from the dead. Harwick saw the tide turning. He screamed something in old Chatty, turned his horse and charged toward Quirinus. They met near the broken body of a standard-bearer. Harwick swung wide, massive axe flashing. Quirinus ducked, rolled, stabbed upward, missed. The axe came down, caught his pauldron, split it. Quirinus fell to one knee. Harwick raised his axe. Quirinus drew his second blade, small, curved, hidden, and drove it into Harwick's heart. "Of Roma," he whispered. Harwick gurgled, dropped the axe, fell. The field paused, then collapsed. The Germans broke. Some fled, some died fighting the flames. Varan limped back with his leg half open. Dren was covered in blood that wasn't his. Quirinus stood alone in the clearing, chest heaving, surrounded by ash and bodies. The forest was still. The trees groaned, but did not whisper. For the first time in generations, Rome had taken Teutoburg back, if only for a breath. They didn't bury the fallen. There were too many. Instead, they stacked the bodies, poured oil, and lit them at dusk. The flames rose higher than the trees. Quirinus stood before them and said only, "You lived." That was enough. No prayer, no lie, just fire, just memory, just marching again. Chapter 8. The River of Bones. They arrived at the Rhine with nothing left but grit and ghosts. The snow had turned to slush. The sky sagged under a quilt of grey, and the wind no longer howled. It hissed like it was trying to whisper them home. The 18th stopped at the tree line, staring at the water. It stretched wide, far wider than memory or maps had promised. The great river pulsed with winter runoff, swollen and fast. Ice chunks spun on the surface like broken shields. Across the current stood Gaul, Roman land, so close, so impossible. The old crossing should have been there. Pons Victrix, the Bridge of Victory, built decades ago, maintained by rotating legions. Now it was a skeleton. The beams were blackened. The decking was gone, just charred stubs and iron spikes jutting from the water like snapped ribs. A fire had taken it, but it hadn't burned recently. The destruction had been days ago. Quirinus knelt near the ruins, rubbed ash between his fingers, still oily, not rain-soaked. He stood, jaw clenched. Someone torched it as a message. Dren crouched beside him and nodded toward the far shore. No movement, no lights. The message is, "You're not welcome home." That night, the first horns blew, not Roman, low, primal, followed by the guttural echo of drums and wolves. Germanic tribes emerged from the tree line behind them. Not a full army, not yet, but scouts, skirmishers and fires, dozens, then hundreds. They weren't charging, they were waiting. The army was encircled, no path forward, no road back. Quirinus gathered his command beneath the remains of a way-station tower, open to the wind. He stared at the river for a long time before speaking. Then, without looking away, he said, "We cross. Tonight," the orders came hard and fast, "dismantle the carts, and lash logs into pontoons, use armour straps for rope, empty amphorae become buoy barrels. Every soldier carries one extra bundle of firewood for someone who won't return." Brother Malleus, now silent by default, broke his vow to whisper, "We'll never make it. Half will drown." Quirinus didn't look at him. "Half is enough." He turned to Dren. "Build the rafts, as many as we can." Then to Varron, "You're staying." Varron raised an eyebrow. "We'll draw them to the wrong fire," Quirinus said, "and you'll light it." He didn't conscript. He stood before the men and spoke. "We need a rear guard, a final stand. I won't lie to you. You'll die, but you'll die loud, and the rest of us will make it." He needed 30. He got 72. They didn't shout. They didn't cheer. They simply stepped forward, one by one, removing their cloaks, sharpening their blades. Most were old. Some were too young. One had lost his hand and tied a dagger to the stump. Quirinus said nothing more. There was no need. By dusk, the decoy fire camp was ready. 3 massive pyres, wrapped in soaked pitchcloth. Torches lined the perimeter, shields placed to catch and reflect light. The camp looked alive from the distance. Inside, the volunteers waited. No armour, no formations, just fury. They sang quietly, not Roman hymns, but old soldiers' dirges, marching tunes, dirty ones. One of them passed around a cracked wine jar with blood on the lip. Another asked to be stabbed before the charge so his wife wouldn't think he ran. Quirinus visited them one last time. "You're not dying," he said. "You're buying." The rafts were primitive. Ropes, broken planks, floating barrels, shields lashed to timbers. They floated like garbage, but they floated. The first wave launched at midnight. 5 men per raft. Dren stood waist-deep in the freezing water, guiding the push-offs. The fog thickened around them, blanketing the river in silence. No cries, no commands, just splashes, breath, prayer. One raft splintered on a submerged branch. 3 men sank. The others paddled harder. Quirinus crossed last, standing at the edge of the water, watching every man disappear into the mist. He did not blink. An hour before dawn, the wolves came. Germanic warriors flooded toward the decoy camp, expecting chaos. They found hell. The 72 lit the pyres and charged into the flames, screaming, blades drawn. It wasn't a defence. It was performance. It was rage and noise and agony with steel. They killed 100 before being surrounded. The Germans thought it was the whole legion. They celebrated. Too soon. On the river, the last raft slid across the current like a shadow. By sunrise, the fires had burned low. The decoy camp was a graveyard. The Germans stood around smouldering corpses, confused. No prisoners, no supplies, no loot, no legion. On the far bank, hidden behind the brush, the survivors of the 18th gathered in silence, not cheering, not celebrating, counting. Quirinus stood alone by the water, watching the smoke rise from the opposite shore. Varron stood beside him, chest bandaged, arms bloody. They died loud. Quirinus nodded, and we lived quiet. There were no names recorded, no scrolls, no roll call, no epitaphs. The river took everything. Quirinus forbade remembrance. No names, no stories, not yet. What we did here, Rome wouldn't understand. He took a coin from his pouch and tossed it into the current. One for the ferryman. The river swallowed it without a sound, and the 18th turned and walked into the trees. Chapter 9. The Shame of Rome. The journey back was a bitter one. 3,000 men. Only 3,000. Of the 12,000 who had set out with Quirinus, the rest had been buried in the snows of Germania or consumed by the river. They had crossed the Rhine, and now they marched under the banners of defeat, back toward a city that would no longer recognize them as heroes. The road to Rome was long, stretching across the Italian countryside, but Quirinus felt none of the glory he had once imagined. His mind was filled with the faces of the fallen, those who had volunteered to die on the other side of the river. Their screams had been drowned out by the roar of the fire and the howling winds of the Germanic hordes, but Quirinus would carry their memory for the rest of his days. They reached the gates of Rome after weeks of silence, no cheers waiting for them, no bands playing, no triumphal procession. There was only silence. The Senate was waiting. The hall was a gauntlet of stairs, of whispered words that turned into muttered curses, and, most notably, the glare of Lucius Antonius, one of Rome's most influential senators, and an enemy to Quirinus. His family's fortune had suffered with the failed campaign. He had lost land, power, and prestige, and he would not let Quirinus's return go unpunished. Quirinus entered the Senate hall with his men flanking him. They had stripped off their armour, their swords left in the barracks as a show of respect, but their uniforms were dirty, tattered, and blood-stained. Some had missing limbs, others had scars that could never be hidden. The men behind him were the broken remnant of a once proud legion, and no amount of honour could erase the shame they felt from their losses. Standing at the centre of the hall, Quirinus stood tall, but his eyes burned with the weight of the trial that awaited him. He could hear the whispers behind him, the calls for his execution, for the blood of the traitor, for the punishment of one who had led so many to die. The tribunes spoke first, questioning his leadership. Why had they failed? Why had they been left behind? Why had Quirinus taken such heavy losses when victory could have been within their grasp? Lucius Antonius rose from his seat with a flourish. His voice rang out like the sound of a stone falling in a quiet valley. This man has brought shame upon Rome, not glory. His arrogance led our finest men into a trap of his own making. He traded our soldiers for survival. He bargained with beasts. He sacrificed the lives of good Roman men for what? To save his own skin? To keep his seat in power? The murmurs grew louder, as if the weight of Antonius's words had struck a deep chord within the Senate. The murmurs rippled out to the crowd of spectators, echoing the growing sentiment of disdain. Quirinus met Antonius's gaze. His eyes were hard, unflinching. He had nothing to fear from this man. "I didn't ask for this," Quirinus said, his voice low but carrying. "I led them as best as I could. No one knew what awaited us in Germania, not even you." Antonius sneered. "You speak of unknowns, Quirinus, but you know better. The legions are not for bargaining, not for treating like cattle. You betrayed us." Through the silence, a voice rose from the back of the hall, an unexpected voice. It was the priestess, the one who had warned him in Germania, the seer whose prophecy had echoed in his mind throughout the campaign. She stepped forward slowly, the thick folds of her dark cloak sweeping across the floor, her expression unreadable. "Rome will always demand more from you. You will never have enough. The only way home is to never belong again." She spoke, her voice trembling slightly but filled with certainty. Her words echoed in the hall, stirring a few senators who had grown uneasy with the mounting accusations, but Lucius Antonius was undeterred. He knew how to manipulate the Senate. He had power, and he had control over the narrative. The seer's words faded as quickly as they came, but Quirinus remembered them well. In the midst of his suffering, they had become his lifeline. Never belong again. The trial had stretched long into the night. The Senate had deliberated, each member taking his turn to cast judgment on the general who had returned from the northern wilderness. Quirinus stood in the centre, hands bound, the eyes of the Senate upon him. Finally the tribune spoke. "Quirinus Octavius, the Senate has found you guilty of negligence, of gross misconduct, and of betrayal. For your actions, for your failure to uphold the honour of Rome, we have decided your punishment." Quirinus braced himself. "We condemn you to exile from the city you once served. You will leave Rome and return no more." The crowd gasped. Some senators looked upon him with pity, others with disgust. But Lucius Antonius only smiled. "Go now. Leave us to our peace." Quirinus turned toward his men, who stood silently at his back. They had survived together. They had endured. It was not a death sentence, but it was worse. Exile meant that he would no longer be a part of the world he had fought for. It meant oblivion. Quirinus stepped out of the Senate hall and into the cold night air. The moon hung low over the city, casting long shadows down the streets. Behind him the gates of Rome loomed like the mouth of some great beast, now closing on him forever. He was no longer the general who had led legions to victory. He was a man without a future. His men followed him. They too were in exile. They had fought and bled for Rome, but they had been abandoned, their victories forgotten in the wake of defeat. "I will not belong again," Quirinus murmured as he looked toward the horizon. "I will make my own way." Chapter 10. The General in the North. If Rome forgets its wolves, the forest will teach them to howl again. 10 years had passed. The empire had stretched and cracked like an old amphora, expanding east while bleeding west, choking on its own bureaucracy. New emperors came and went like storms, each promising order, none delivering it. The roads were less patrolled, the legions were thinner. Rome still called itself eternal, but eternity had a limp. Far from the Senate's gaze, where the land curved upward into pine-shrouded hills and broken passes, sat a lonely outpost known to none but ghosts, Fort Voynix. It had no governor, no tribune, no formal charter, only walls, high, solid, carved with teeth, and fires that never went out. Locals called it the Refuge. Inside, the snow melted slowly even in spring. Black wolves roamed near the outer ridge, but never crossed the perimeter. They knew who ruled here. They didn't call him general anymore. They called him Quirinus, whispered like a prayer or a curse. He still rose before dawn, still carried his blade, older now, notched, more memory than weapon. His face had grown carved with lines, and his beard was streaked with iron grey, but his eyes were sharp as ever. The kind of sharp that saw through lies, the kind of sharp that never truly closed, even in sleep. Children ran at his heels. Young men and women lined up to spar beneath the frost-draped pines. They trained not with the drills of Rome, but with silence, with rope and mud, with patience. He taught them how to move unseen, how to think in cold, how to die without screaming. "We are not Romans any more," he'd tell them. "Rome is an idea. We are consequence." He never raised his voice, but when he spoke, the air held still to listen. There were no standards here, no insignia, no coin, only trust earned in blood. The eldest veterans of the 18th, those who had survived the river, the forest, the betrayal, had followed Quirinus into exile and stayed. They built Fort 59 with their bare hands, stone by stone, in the shadow of a Roman world that no longer wanted them. Now, those men and women led small bands of soldiers in training, forming units that lived more like families than centuries. Each group had its own name: the Teeth, the Ash Hands, the Broken Watch, the Silent Flame, and its own rites. They carved stories into bark. They made armour from wolf hide and old iron. They sang not hymns to Jupiter, but wordless songs that rose with the wind. Some of them had never seen Rome, others had run from it. All of them called this place home. Visitors came now and then. Pilgrims, refugees, mercenaries. They came broken and left sharpened. Many didn't know the stories were true until they arrived, that a ghost general taught forgotten arts in the frost-bitten corners of the world, that he built warriors, not soldiers, that he trained an army not for Rome's glory, but for its reckoning. Quirinus listened to their tales at night, seated by a massive fire pit surrounded by standing stones. He asked questions, never gave answers. Sometimes he would disappear into the woods for days. When he returned, he said nothing, but something in him would shift, his shoulders more certain, his eyes more tired. They whispered that he spoke to wolves. Others said he carried a map of Rome's collapse tattooed on his back. He never confirmed either. It was the second thaw of the year when she came again. Her gait was bent, her hands twisted by age and frostbite. One eye was blind, the other sharp as a hawk's. Her cloak dragged behind her like a shadow. Snow hissed away from her steps. She found Quirinus where she always did, at the edge of the cliff above the valley, watching the mist rise from the trees. She sat beside him without a word. Minutes passed. Only after the crows circled once overhead did she speak. "You said you wanted peace." "I lied," he said. She chuckled, a dry rasp like leaves cracking underfoot. "You were always meant to break things. I built this." He motioned toward the fort, toward the training fields, toward the children with spears. "You built what Rome never understood." She unwrapped a small scroll from within her furs and placed it in his lap. The seal was black wax, marked with the old imperial crest, burned and smeared. "They remember you now." He did not open it. "They'll come," she added. "Not today, not this year, but they will come." He looked up at the red sun cresting the pines. "Then they'll meet something they forgot. Wolves, survivors." That night, Quirinus held council with his old comrades. Dren, now a one-armed forge master, Varan, who hadn't spoken since the river, and a dozen others who had bled with him when the world still made sense. They sat in a circle, firelight catching the worn leather of their cloaks, the gleam of steel beneath. Quirinus read the scroll aloud. "By decree of the Senate and the Emperor's will, Quirinus Octavius is hereby restored." The rest didn't matter. He dropped it into the flames. "They want a general," he said, "but they'll get a forest." No one asked for orders. They simply nodded, and one by one they returned to sharpen the blades. The next morning the children were taught a new song. It had no name. It spoke of a man who crossed rivers made of ice and bones, of a fire camp lit by the dead, of a city that exiled its defenders and called it justice, of a man who taught his soldiers to bleed for each other, not for flags. It was whispered that Quirinus would never return to Rome. He didn't need to, because Rome would come to him, and when it did, it would find the cold, the pine, the silence, and the wolves waiting. Quirinus stood at the gates as dusk fell. Snow drifted in lazy spirals. His cloak billowed like smoke behind him. Children watched from the battlements, holding torches wide-eyed. The old seer stood beside him. "Will you fight them?" she asked. He smiled. "No. Then what?" He looked toward the horizon, where Rome lay, soft and far. "If Rome forgets its wolves," he said, voice a whisper, "the forest will teach them to howl again." The end. Author's note: The Last March of Quirinus. Thank you for joining me on this journey through snow, fire, and shadow. The Last March of Quirinus is more than a tale of war. It's a story of leadership, exile, and the quiet strength that grows far from the Senate's gaze. In the end, this wasn't about Rome's glory, but the survival of those it left behind. If this story moved you, if you felt the frost, heard the wolves, or marched alongside the forgotten, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe to support more epic storytelling. Your voice keeps the fire lit. Brian M. Brumbaugh,